My parents spent 20 years building my brother's future until he unknowingly begged me for a job at the company I secretly owned. I used to believe every parent loved their children equally. Maybe differently, but equally. It took me 20 years to realize that wasn't always true. Some parents don't just have favorites. They build their entire lives around one child, while expecting the other to quietly disappear into the background. My name is Noah. I'm 32 now, and if you'd met my family 10 years ago, you would have assumed my older brother Mason was destined for greatness. My parents certainly believed he was. Growing up, our house felt less like a home and more like a museum dedicated to Mason. Every wall carried another reminder of his achievements. Soccer medals, basketball trophies, framed newspaper clippings, photos from award ceremonies. There was even an entire bookshelf filled with plaques he'd collected over the years. Visitors always stopped to admire it. My mom loved giving the tour. This one was for the regional championship. This one was MVP. Oh, and here's the newspaper article about his game-winning goal. She smiled every single time she told those stories. Meanwhile, my own award stayed hidden inside my bedroom closet. Not because I wanted them there, because nobody ever asked where they were. I remember being 12 years old when I won first place in the state science competition. It was the biggest accomplishment of my life. More than 300 students competed. I spent 4 months building a renewable energy project entirely by myself. When they announced my name, I honestly believed my parents would finally be proud. I couldn't wait to get home. I walked through the front door carrying the trophy with both hands. MOM. No answer. Dad. Still nothing. I found them in the backyard. They were helping Mason practice penalty kicks. Dad, look what I won. He glanced at the trophy for maybe 2 seconds. That's nice. Then he tossed another soccer ball toward Mason. Again, I stood there waiting. Surely they'd ask about the competition. Surely they'd want to know what happened. Instead, my mom smiled without looking away from Mason. Put it on your desk, sweetheart. That was it. No hug, no celebration, no questions. That night, I carried the trophy upstairs, placed it inside my closet, and quietly closed the door. It stayed there for almost 15 years, still wrapped in the same blue ribbon. Sometimes people ask me when I stopped trying to impress my parents. It wasn't one big moment. It happened little by little. Every forgotten birthday, every canceled promise, every achievement that somehow became another reason to talk about Mason. By the time I reached high school, I'd already accepted something most kids should never have to learn. I wasn't competing against the world. I was competing against my own brother. And in my parents' eyes, that was a competition I could never win. Mason wasn't cruel, at least not at first. When we were little, he actually looked after me. He taught me how to ride a bicycle. He defended me when older kids picked fights. He even shared his Halloween candy. Looking back, I don't think he was born arrogant. I think my parents accidentally created that version of him. Imagine spending your entire childhood hearing, "You're special, you're the future, you're different." Eventually, you start believing everyone else exists one step below you. That's exactly what happened to Mason. Every mistake he made became someone else's fault. Every success became proof he was extraordinary. If he forgot homework, the teacher was unfair. If he failed a test, the questions were badly written. If he got into a fight, the other kid must have started it. There were never consequences, only excuses. And every excuse made him a little more convinced that rules were for everyone else. I learned the opposite lesson. Nobody was coming to save me. If I wanted something, I had to build it myself. By 14, I discovered something that changed everything. Computers, not games. Programming. The first time I wrote a simple program that actually worked, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Control. Computers didn't care who my parents loved more. They didn't compare me to Mason. The code either worked or it didn't. It was honest. So I became obsessed. Every afternoon after school, while Mason was at practice, I sat in my room watching free programming tutorials online. I borrowed old books from the public library. I spent entire weekends learning languages most people couldn't even pronounce. Python, Java, C#, JavaScript. The more I learned, the more I realized something incredible. People actually paid for these skills, not because they knew your family, not because your parents had connections, because you solved problems. That idea became my escape. One rainy Thursday afternoon, my computer science teacher stopped me after class. "Noah." I turned around. He held up one of my assignments. "Did you really build this yourself?" "Yes." He looked genuinely impressed. "I've been teaching for 22 years. I've never seen a sophomore submit something this advanced." Nobody had ever said anything like that to me before, not even close. For a moment, I forgot how to answer. He smiled. "You know, there are companies that pay high school students to do freelance work." I laughed. "I don't think anyone would pay me." He looked me straight in the eyes. "They will." That conversation changed the direction of my life forever. For the next 3 years, my life followed the exact same routine. Wake up, go to school, come home, finish homework, write code until 2 or 3 in the morning, sleep for 4 hours, repeat. Most teenagers spent weekends hanging out with friends. I spent mine fixing bugs for clients I'd never meet. It wasn't because I loved working. It was because every dollar I earned felt like another brick in the life I wanted to build. By the time I turned 16, I'd earned just over $12,000. Not from my parents, not from an allowance, not from birthday gifts. Every single cent came from writing software. I never told anyone, especially not my family, because I already knew what would happen. Dad would call it a hobby. Mom would say I was spending too much time on the computer. And Mason, he'd laugh, just like he laughed at everything else I cared about. One Friday afternoon, I came home carrying an envelope. Inside was a letter from a software company. They wanted to hire me part-time after graduation. The salary was more money than either of my parents had ever earned at that age. I was excited, not because of the paycheck, because someone believed I was actually good enough. I walked into the kitchen. Mom was making dinner. Dad home. Living room. I smiled. I've got something to show you. Dad barely looked away from the television. What is it? I handed him the letter. He read the first paragraph, then placed it back on the table. That's nice. I waited. Nothing. No congratulations. No questions. Nothing. Finally, he asked, did Mason call? What? He had another interview today. I slowly shook my head. Dad handed me back the envelope. Let me know when he gets home. That was the entire conversation. 2 hours later, Mason walked through the front door. Dad immediately stood up. How'd it go? I got it. The entire house exploded with excitement. Mom hugged him. Dad opened a bottle of champagne he'd been saving. My grandmother called. Aunts, uncles, neighbors. Everyone heard the news before dinner. Nobody mentioned the letter still sitting beside my plate. Later that night, Mom walked into my room. Oh, I forgot. She handed me the envelope. What was this again? I smiled. It doesn't matter. She nodded. Good. You know your brother's big day shouldn't be overshadowed. She closed the door. I looked down at the offer letter, then quietly folded it back into the envelope. That night, I made another promise to myself. From now on, I would stop looking for validation from people who had already decided my worth. The following summer, I graduated. My parents rented a hotel ballroom for Mason's graduation party. There were balloons, professional photographers, a DJ, nearly 150 guests. 3 weeks later, I graduated too. Mom suggested we order pizza. Dad said, we already spend enough celebrating. That sentence stayed with me for years. We already spent enough. Apparently, my future wasn't worth another celebration. College became my escape. I received a full scholarship, moved into a tiny dorm room, and for the first time in my life, nobody compared me to Mason. Professors only cared if my work was good. Classmates respected skill. Clients respected results. Life suddenly felt fair. I worked harder than ever. During the day, classes. At night, freelance development. Weekends, building software products I hoped to sell one day. Most people thought I was obsessed. Maybe they were right. But obsession has a funny way of looking like madness, right before it becomes success. Meanwhile, back home, Mason was living exactly the life my parents had imagined. Dad helped him buy a brand new truck. Mom decorated his apartment. Family dinners became an hour-long presentation about everything Mason had accomplished that week. One Sunday, Dad looked across the table at me. So, when are you going to stop playing with computers and get a real career? I smiled. I'm actually making pretty good money. Dad laughed. No, I mean adult money. Everyone laughed with him, except Grandma. She quietly looked at me and asked, are you happy? I nodded. Very. She smiled. That's all that matters. Looking back, she was the only person in my family who ever asked that question. We've heard very good things about your company. He paused. We'd like to discuss a contract. I had no idea that one meeting was about to change my life forever. The conference room suddenly felt much smaller. 3 executives from Apex Infrastructure sat across from me. Flipping through the proposal, Carl and I had spent nearly 6 weeks preparing. No one spoke for almost a minute. The only sound in the room was the ticking clock on the wall. Finally, Richard Lawson closed the folder. He looked directly at me. So, this software, you designed the architecture yourself? I nodded. Every line of the original code. He leaned back in his chair. You realize there are companies 10 times your size that couldn't build this. Carl looked at me and smiled. I'd seen that smile before. It was the smile that said, I told you your hard work would matter one day. Richard stood up and walked toward the window. I've been in business for 28 years. I've learned one thing. You don't invest in buildings. You don't invest in software. You invest in people. He turned around, and I think you're someone worth investing in. For a second, I honestly forgot how to breathe. He extended his hand. I'd like to offer your company a 5-year partnership. The contract was worth more money than my business had earned in its entire existence. I looked at Carl. Carl looked at me. Neither of us said a word, because neither of us trusted ourselves not to sound emotional. That evening, everyone went home to celebrate. Everyone except me. I stayed in the office, walked through every empty room, past every desk, every computer, every meeting room. For years earlier, I'd been sitting alone inside a leaking warehouse, wondering whether I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. Now, one signature had changed everything. I walked into my office, sat down, and quietly cried. Not because of the money, because for the first time, I felt like 12-year-old Noah had finally been proven right. Maybe he was good enough after all. The next 6 months felt unreal. The company doubled in size, then doubled again. We hired engineers from all over the country. Entire departments were created overnight. The warehouse became too small. Again, Carl walked into my office one morning carrying another stack of reports. We've got a problem." I looked up. "What happened?" "We're out of parking spaces." I laughed. "That's a good problem. It gets worse. We're also out of offices, and conference rooms, and storage." I looked around. Every inch of the building was full. Employees were holding meetings in the cafeteria. Developers were sharing desks. Recruiters were interviewing candidates in the hallway. The company had officially outgrown its home. 3 months later, we signed the paperwork for an entire office building. 6 floors, glass walls, underground parking, a rooftop terrace. When I held the keys, I couldn't stop thinking about Dad. Years ago, he laughed when I rented a garage. I wondered what he'd say if he saw this place. Then I smiled to myself. He'd probably still find something to criticize. Some people never change. Oddly enough, I never told my parents. Not once. People always ask why. The answer is simple. Because they never asked. Not a single phone call. Not one text message. No questions about my company. No curiosity about my work. Every conversation somehow became about Mason. Always Mason. At family dinners, nothing had changed. Dad still bragged about him. Mom still smiled every time he walked into the room. The only difference was Mason wasn't smiling as much anymore. He looked tired, older, like someone carrying a secret he couldn't put down. One Sunday, Dad raised his glass. A toast. "Our son's about to become regional director." Everyone clapped. Mason forced a smile, but I noticed something. He never looked Dad in the eyes. Not once. After dinner, he followed me outside. "Got a minute?" We stood beside my car. For almost 30 seconds, he said nothing. Finally, he sighed. "How's the business?" I shrugged. "It's okay." He nodded. "Still coding?" "Yeah." Another silence. Then, without looking at me, he quietly asked, "You ever feel like everyone's expecting too much from you?" I looked at him. That wasn't the Mason I remembered. The old Mason would have bragged. This one looked exhausted. "What happened?" He laughed. "You ever fake being happy for so long that eventually you forget what being happy actually feels like?" I didn't answer, because I knew exactly what he meant, just for different reasons. He rubbed his face. "I've got to go." Before he left, he looked back at me. "I'm glad at least one of us figured life out." I watched him drive away. That sentence stayed in my head for days. 2 weeks later, my phone rang. It was Mom. Her voice sounded different. Panicked. "Noah, can you come over?" "What happened?" "It's your father." I drove there immediately. Dad was sitting at the kitchen table, silent. The confident man I'd grown up fearing suddenly looked 20 years older. Mom placed a folder in front of me. "Read it." Inside were bank statements, loan documents, mortgage papers, credit card balances. The numbers didn't make sense. I looked up. "What is all this?" Dad stared at the table. "It's Mason." Mom started crying. "He never told us. He kept borrowing. We kept helping. We thought things would get better. They didn't." The total debt was almost $700,000. I honestly thought I'd read it wrong. Dad whispered, "I refinanced the house." Mom added quietly, "and emptied our retirement account." Neither of them looked at me. They looked ashamed. For the first time in my life, my parents didn't seem powerful. They seemed broken. Then Dad asked a question I never expected to hear. "Noah, can your company hire Mason?" The room became completely silent. I looked at both of them. Neither of them knew. They were asking the owner. Nobody spoke. The kitchen felt strangely quiet. I looked down at the papers again. $700,000. If someone had told me 5 years earlier that my parents would lose almost everything because of Mason, I would have called them crazy. Growing up, they acted like he could never make a mistake. Now, those mistakes were sitting in front of us, printed in black and white. Dad finally cleared his throat. "I know I don't have the right to ask, but if your company has an opening, maybe you could recommend him." Recommend him. That word almost made me smile. Not because it was funny, because my parents still believed I was just another employee. They had absolutely no idea the recommendation they were asking for would come from the owner himself. I looked at Dad. "What makes you think I have that kind of influence?" He shrugged. "You've worked there a while. You probably know a manager." I nodded slowly. "Maybe." Mom reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Please, he's your brother." I looked at Mason's empty chair. For the first time, it wasn't anger I felt. It was disappointment. Not in him. In all of us. This family had spent 20 years pretending everything revolved around one person. Now, the moment life became difficult, everyone expected someone else to fix it. "I'll see what I can do." That was all I said. Dad let out a breath of relief. Mom smiled through her tears. Neither of them asked another question. Not about my job. Not about my salary. Not about my life. The conversation returned to Mason almost immediately. Just like always. The next morning, I arrived at headquarters before sunrise. The city was still waking up. Streetlights reflected off the glass walls of our building. Cleaning crews were finishing their shifts. The lobby was completely silent. I loved mornings like this. Before the meetings, before the emails, before everyone needed something from me. It reminded me of the old warehouse. Back when the company was just a dream. I took the private elevator to the executive floor. My assistant, Emily, was already waiting outside my office. "Good morning." "Morning." She handed me a tablet. "We've received another application for the regional sales position." "I know. Mason Carter." She looked confused. "You've already seen it." "I have." She hesitated. "HR thinks he's qualified." "I agree." "You do?" I nodded. "He deserves an interview." Emily smiled. "I'll schedule one for Friday." I stopped her. "No." She looked back. "I'll interview him personally." Her eyebrows lifted. The CEO usually doesn't interview department managers. I know, this one's different. She didn't ask why. That was one thing I appreciated about Emily. She knew when not to ask questions. Friday arrived faster than I expected. At 9:15, security called. Your candidate is here. I looked through the camera feed. There he was, standing alone in the lobby, holding a worn leather folder. His suit looked expensive once, but not anymore. The shoulders were slightly faded. The cuffs showed signs of wear. Even his shoes, the same man who once owned 4 luxury cars, had clearly been polished dozens of times. Life had humbled him. Instead of taking the private elevator, I decided to walk downstairs. I wanted to see something. As I stepped into the lobby, Mason was standing in front of the company timeline displayed across the wall. Photos stretched from one end to the other. The tiny warehouse, our first 10 employees, our first international client, the ribbon-cutting ceremony, magazine covers, awards, every major milestone. He studied each picture carefully, then quietly said to the receptionist, "I can't believe one guy built all of this." She smiled proudly. Our CEO started with almost nothing. He still tells everyone the company began in a warehouse with a leaking roof. Mason laughed softly. "Must be nice. You have no idea." The receptionist smiled. "He's actually one of the nicest bosses I've ever worked for." I stood there listening, without saying a word. Emily finally walked over. "Mr. Carter." He turned. "The CEO is ready for you." He froze. "The CEO?" "Yes. I thought I was meeting the sales director." Emily smiled politely. Our CEO likes interviewing leadership candidates himself. For a split second, I watched every emotion cross Mason's face. Confusion, nervousness, curiosity, then determination. He straightened his tie, picked up his folder, and followed Emily toward the elevator. He still had absolutely no idea who he was about to meet. 5 minutes later, Emily knocked on my office door. "He's here." I nodded. "Send him in." The door opened. Mason walked inside confidently. He didn't look at me immediately. Instead, his eyes wandered around the office. Floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline, bookshelves, awards, company trophies, family photographs. Then, his eyes reached the desk, and finally, they landed on me. He stopped walking. The color drained from his face. "Noah." I stood, smiled politely. "Good morning." For several long seconds, he didn't move. He looked behind him, then back at me, then at the name engraved on the desk. Noah Carter, founder and chief executive officer. He blinked once, twice, 3 times, as if reading the same words over and over might somehow change them. His voice barely came out. "No, this can't be right." I walked around the desk and extended my hand. "Welcome, I'm Noah, and I'll be conducting your interview today." He stared at my hand, unable to speak, unable to move. The younger brother he'd spent years calling the kid with computers was standing in front of him, not as an employee, not as a manager, but as the man who owned everything he could see. The office, the building, the company. His future was now sitting across the desk from the brother he'd underestimated his entire life. And deep down, we both knew this interview was no longer just about a job. It was about 20 years of choices. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Mason kept staring at the nameplate on my desk, then at the company logo behind me, then back at me. He looked like someone trying to wake up from a dream. Finally, he laughed, not because anything was funny, because sometimes your brain laughs before it accepts reality. "You own this place?" "Yes." "The whole company?" "Yes." "The building too?" I nodded. "Everything." He slowly sat down without taking his eyes off me. His hands were shaking. I don't understand." I smiled politely. "What part?" "You. This. Everything. You were." He stopped himself. "I was what?" He looked down at the floor. "The quiet one." I couldn't help smiling. Apparently, silence filled the room again. After nearly a minute, he whispered, "Mom and Dad don't know. They still think you work here." "I know. Why didn't you tell them?" I looked toward the city outside my office window. "Because they never cared enough to ask." He lowered his head. There wasn't anything he could say to that, because he knew it was true. I opened his resume again. "Let's finish the interview." He looked confused. "You still want to interview me? This isn't personal. This is business." He nodded. For the next 20 minutes, I asked every question exactly the same way I'd ask any other candidate. Sales strategy, leadership, conflict resolution, team management, customer retention. Unlike the old Mason, this version didn't exaggerate. When he didn't know an answer, he admitted it. When he made mistakes, he owned them. That surprised me. The arrogant older brother I'd grown up with would have blamed everyone else. This man looked exhausted, almost humbled. When the interview ended, I closed the folder. "You have solid experience." Hope appeared on his face. "But," the word hit him immediately. "But, you've changed jobs 4 times in 3 years." He nodded slowly. "I know. You also have financial problems." His eyes widened. "How?" "We run background checks on management applicants." He sighed. "Right." I leaned back. "If I hired anyone else with this record, my board would question my decision." He swallowed hard. "I understand." For the first time in his life, he wasn't asking for special treatment. He simply accepted the consequences. That alone told me he'd changed. He stood up. "I appreciate the interview. I know this must have been awkward." He picked up his resume. "I'm sorry I wasted your time." He reached the door. "Mason." He stopped, without turning around. "I haven't said no." Slowly, he looked back. "What?" I folded my my hands. I'll offer you the position. His eyes filled with disbelief. Really? Yes. Then I raised one finger. Under one condition. He immediately nodded. Anything. No one, and I mean absolutely no one, finds out we're brothers. He stared at me. Why? Because if people think you got this job because of me, they'll never respect you. And if they think I hired family, they'll stop trusting my decisions. He thought about it, then quietly nodded. I understand. I continued. You'll start exactly like everyone else. No special treatment. No shortcuts. If you fail, you're gone. If you succeed, you'll earn every promotion, just like everyone else. He looked me directly in the eyes. Then something happened that I never expected. He smiled. Not the confident smile from childhood. Not the arrogant smile I'd seen for years. This one looked grateful. I'd rather earn it. Those 4 words surprised me more than anything else he'd said. Maybe people really could change. Monday morning arrived. Word spread quickly that a new regional sales manager had joined the company. Most employees welcomed him warmly. A few were skeptical, as they were with every new manager. Nobody knew he was my brother, exactly the way I wanted it. For the first few weeks, I watched from a distance. Every manager submits weekly reports directly to my office. Mason's reports were good, not amazing, not terrible, good. He worked late, asked questions, accepted criticism. He even volunteered to help junior sales representatives. Carl noticed too. One afternoon, he walked into my office carrying another report. You know, I think we finally hired someone decent. I smiled. What makes you say that? He reminds me of you. That almost made me laugh. In what way? He stays late, doesn't complain, and he actually listens. Carl shrugged. Not many managers do. I looked down at the report again. Maybe this really was a different Mason. 3 months passed. One afternoon, Emily knocked on my office door. Your parents are downstairs. I looked up immediately. My parents? Yes. They're asking to meet whoever hired Mr. Mason Carter. For a second, I just sat there. They'd never visited me at work. Not once. Not in 5 years. Now, they were standing in my lobby, completely unaware that the man they wanted to thank was their own son. I stood up slowly, straightened my jacket, looked out through the glass wall toward the reception area below. Dad was wearing his best suit. Mom held a small gift basket in her hands. They looked nervous, proud, excited. They still believed their favorite son had finally found someone willing to save his career. Neither of them had the slightest idea that they were about to discover who had built the company they admired. And once they walked through my office doors, our family would never be the same again. For almost a full minute, I simply stood there, looking through the glass wall overlooking the lobby. My parents had never visited my office before. Not when we hired our 50th employee. Not when we moved into this building. Not when business magazines started writing about us. Not even when our company logo appeared on billboards across the city. But today they were here. Because of Mason, some things never change. Emily stood beside my desk. Would you like me to send them up? I took a slow breath. Yes. And Emily, don't tell them anything. She nodded. Of course. Downstairs, the receptionist smiled politely. Mr. and Mrs. Carter? Dad stood up immediately. Yes. The CEO is ready to see you. Dad looked surprised. The CEO himself? Yes, sir. We're honored. Mom straightened her dress. She whispered, I can't believe someone this important wants to meet us. Dad smiled proudly. It's because of Mason. He must have impressed everyone. Neither of them noticed, the receptionist trying not to smile. The private elevator doors opened. Emily greeted them. This way, please. As they walked through the executive floor, Dad couldn't stop looking around. Glass offices, conference rooms, awards displayed along the hallway, employees greeting one another with respect. He quietly said, this place is unbelievable. Mom nodded. I wonder what kind of man builds something like this. Emily smiled. Someone who worked very hard. They reached my office. Emily knocked once. Come in. She opened the door. Dad walked in first, still smiling, still expecting to meet a stranger. Then he looked toward my desk. His smile disappeared. Mom froze beside him. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. I stood up. Hi. Silence. Dad blinked. Noah. Mom looked around the room, confused. What are you doing here? I smiled politely. I work here. Dad frowned. We know that. We're here to meet the CEO. You are. Another silence. Dad laughed. No, I mean the real CEO. I slowly walked around my desk, stopped beside the nameplate. Noah Carter, founder and chief executive officer. Mom's eyes followed me. Then the nameplate. Then the framed awards behind me. Then the magazine cover on the wall. Finally, she whispered, oh my God. Dad still looked confused. This is some kind of joke. I calmly picked up the framed photo from my desk. It showed me standing beside our first warehouse. This was our first office. I pointed toward another photo. This was our 10th employee. Another, our first international contract. Another, the ribbon-cutting ceremony for this building. Dad looked from picture to picture. His face slowly lost all color. He wasn't looking at decorations anymore. He was looking at 20 years he'd completely missed. Mom covered her mouth. You built all of this? Yes. When? Over the last 8 years. Dad sat down without asking, as if his legs had suddenly become too weak. No, you would have told us. I looked at him quietly. I tried. When? The day I got my first software job. You were watching television. His eyes dropped. I continued. The day I started freelancing. You called it playing with computers. computers. He remained silent. The day I rented my first office. You laughed. Another silence. The day I hired my first employee. You asked when I'd get a real job. Mom slowly began crying. Real tears. Not dramatic. Just quiet, uncontrollable tears. I don't remember. I do. Nobody spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Dad looked around the office again. This company. How many people work here? 386. He swallowed. And how much is it worth? I answered honestly. Last valuation, just over $200 million. The room became completely silent. Mom started crying even harder. Dad closed his eyes. For the first time in my life, the strongest man I'd ever known looked completely broken. He whispered, I spent my whole life believing Mason was going to become successful. I nodded. I know. Then he asked the question that hurt more than anything else. Why didn't you tell us? I looked directly at him. My voice stayed calm. Because every time I tried, you were too busy talking about Mason. Nobody argued. Because nobody could. They all knew it was true. Just then, another knock came at the door. Emily stepped inside. Sorry to interrupt. Mr. Mason Carter is here for his weekly performance review. I smiled. Send him in. Dad looked confused. Mason works here. Before anyone answered, the door opened. Mason walked inside carrying a folder. The moment he saw Mom and Dad, he stopped. The moment they looked at him, they realized something. He wasn't surprised to see me sitting in the CEO's chair because he already knew. And that realization hurt them even more than the truth itself. The room fell completely silent. Mason stood frozen in the doorway. The folder in his hand slowly slipped to his side. His eyes moved from me to Mom to Dad. Nobody knew what to say. Finally, Dad broke the silence. You. His voice cracked. You knew? Mason closed the door behind him. Yeah. For how long? Since the interview. Mom looked completely lost. You've known all this time, and you never told us? Mason lowered his head. I couldn't. Why not? Because I was ashamed. Those words hit the room like a punch. Ashamed. It wasn't a word I'd ever imagined hearing from my brother. Dad stood up. His face had turned red. You let us believe Noah was just another employee. You watched us make fools of ourselves. I know. And you said nothing? Mason finally looked him in the eyes. Would you have believed me? Dad opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because deep down, he already knew the answer. No, he wouldn't have. If someone had told him 6 months ago that Noah owned one of the fastest growing software companies in the country, he would have laughed, just like he'd laughed every other time. Mom slowly walked toward Mason. Her voice trembled. Why didn't you tell us the first day? He smiled sadly. Because the first thing I thought wasn't. I need to tell Mom and Dad. It was, how did I spend my whole life looking down on someone who accomplished all of this? The room went quiet again. I finally spoke. Mason. He looked at me. Can you give us a minute? He nodded immediately. Without saying another word, he walked out of the office. The door clicked shut behind him. Now, it was just the three of us. For the first time in my life. No trophies, no comparisons, no distractions, just silence. Dad looked around my office one more time. His eyes landed on the oldest photograph hanging near the bookshelf. It showed me standing beside our first warehouse, holding a faded cardboard sign. My clothes looked too big. My smile looked exhausted. Dad slowly walked toward it. When was this taken? 8 years ago. He kept staring. I don't remember this. I know. You never asked. He closed his eyes. Every answer I gave somehow led back to the same sentence. You never asked. Mom noticed another frame sitting on the shelf. It wasn't an award. It was a picture of an old blue ribbon. She picked it up carefully. What is this? I smiled softly. My state science competition. The one I won when I was 12. She frowned. I don't remember. Then she stopped talking. Because suddenly, she did. She remembered. The afternoon in the backyard, helping Mason practice soccer. Me standing there, holding that trophy. Waiting. Hoping. She slowly sat down. Oh no. Tears rolled down her face. I remember. I told you to put it in your room. I nodded. You never even asked what the competition was. She covered her face. I'm so sorry. Those words should have felt satisfying. I'd imagined hearing them 1,000 times growing up. But now that they were finally here, they didn't erase anything. Some wounds don't disappear just because someone finally notices them. Dad walked back toward my desk. His shoulders looked smaller than I'd ever seen them. When did we lose you? I looked at him quietly. You didn't lose me. You just never noticed. When I stopped waiting, he sat down again. His eyes filled with tears. I thought I was preparing Mason for success. I answered gently. You were protecting him from failure. And in the process, you taught him he never had to earn anything. Dad looked toward the door. I failed both of you. Nobody argued. Because this time, he wasn't wrong. For several minutes, none of us spoke. The city stretched beyond the glass windows. Employees walked through the hallway outside. Business continued as usual. Inside my office, 20 years of silence were finally catching up with us. Mom finally whispered, "Can you ever forgive us?" I didn't answer immediately, because forgiveness isn't a simple word. People talk about it like it's a switch. You either forgive or you don't. Real life isn't like that. Some pain fades slowly. Some memories never do. Finally, I looked at both of them. I don't hate you. Mom cried even harder. But I can't pretend my childhood happened differently. I can't erase years of feeling invisible. I can't go back and become the little boy who stopped bringing trophies home. Dad nodded slowly. I understand. No, I said quietly. I don't think you do. I stood up, walked toward the large window, looking down at hundreds of employees entering and leaving the building. You know what hurt the most? It wasn't the birthdays. It wasn't the gifts. It wasn't even the comparisons. I paused. It was believing, for years, that maybe I just wasn't enough. The room became completely silent. Mom broke down completely. Dad buried his face in his hands. Neither of them tried to defend themselves, because there was nothing left to defend. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Emily stepped inside. I'm sorry, but the board meeting starts in 10 minutes. I nodded. I'll be there. She quietly left. Dad stood up. We should go. Before leaving, he stopped beside my desk. For the first time in my entire life, my father reached out and hugged me. It wasn't a long hug. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. And somehow, that made it hurt even more. As they walked toward the door, Dad turned back one last time. I know I can't change the past, but if you'll let me, I'd like the chance to be a better father than I was. I didn't answer, not because I wanted to punish him, because some answers take time. They quietly left the office. The door closed behind them. I stood there alone, staring at the city skyline, thinking about the little boy who once believed he'd never be enough. If only he could see this moment, he'd finally know he never needed anyone else's approval to become someone extraordinary. The office felt strangely quiet after my parents left. For the first time in years, I wasn't angry. I wasn't relieved. I just felt empty. 8 years. That's how long I'd spent building this company. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted to prove anyone wrong, but because somewhere inside me, there was still a 12-year-old kid hoping someone would finally say, "We're proud of you." The strange part was, now that I'd finally heard those words, they didn't mean as much as I thought they would. Over the next few weeks, things slowly returned to normal, at least inside the company. Nobody knew what had happened in my office. Employees continued working. Meetings continued. Projects continued. Business never waits for personal problems. One afternoon, Carl walked into my office carrying 2 coffees. He sat across from me. "You've been distracted." I smiled. "That obvious?" He laughed. "I've known you for 8 years. When something's bothering you, you start organizing your desk." I looked down. He was right. Everything on my desk was perfectly aligned. Carl took a sip of his coffee. "So, family." I nodded. He didn't ask another question. Instead, he said something I'd never forget. "You know, some people spend their whole lives trying to earn love. They don't realize real love doesn't need to be earned." For some reason, that hit harder than anything else I'd heard that week. Meanwhile, Mason surprised everyone, including me. He became one of the hardest working managers in the company. He arrived before everyone else, left after everyone else, never used our relationship to ask for favors, never once mentioned he was the CEO's brother. One Friday evening, I noticed the lights were still on in the sales department. It was nearly 9 o'clock. Everyone else had gone home. I walked downstairs. Mason was sitting alone, reviewing client reports. He looked up. "Oh, sorry. I didn't realize anyone was still here." I smiled. I was about to say the same thing. He laughed quietly. For the first time in years, the conversation didn't feel awkward. After a few minutes, he pushed the reports aside. "I owe you an apology." I stayed silent. He continued. "When we were kids, I thought I was better than you. I really believed it. Not because you deserved it, because Mom and Dad made me believe it." He rubbed his hands together. "I used to think confidence meant always being right. You taught me it's actually admitting when you're wrong." I looked at him for a long moment, then simply nodded. "Thank you." He smiled. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know. Sometimes, that's enough." 3 months later, Dad called, not to ask about Mason, not to ask for money, not to compare us. He asked one simple question. "You free for dinner?" I almost laughed. It had been years since he'd invited me anywhere. When I arrived, something immediately felt different. The walls were empty. I looked around. The huge collection of Mason's trophies was gone. Every single one. Instead, family photographs covered the shelves. Pictures of vacations, birthdays, Christmas mornings, and, to my surprise, there was a framed copy of my first software award. The same one that had spent 15 years hidden in my closet. Mom noticed me staring. She smiled through tears. "I found it. I cleaned it. It deserves to be out here." I walked closer, ran my fingers across the frame. The blue ribbon was still attached, exactly the way I'd left it. For a second, I couldn't speak. Dinner felt different too. Nobody compared anyone. Nobody kept score. Nobody talked about who was more successful. Dad asked about my company. Not the money, not the valuation. The people. What are your employees like? What do you enjoy most? What keeps you motivated? Those were questions I'd waited 20 years to hear. After dinner, Dad asked me to stay behind. We sat on the back porch, the same place where Mason used to practice soccer. He looked out toward the yard. "I've been thinking. You know the biggest mistake I made?" I stayed quiet. I confused achievement with character. I spent years celebrating success. I forgot to celebrate kindness. He looked at me. "You became the man I hoped Mason would become." And I never even noticed. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then, he quietly said, "I'm proud of you, son. Not because of the company, not because of the money, because of the man you've become." Those words finally felt different. Because Because this time, they weren't about success. They were about me. A year later, our company celebrated its 10th anniversary. Every employee gathered in the auditorium. Families were invited. Carl stood beside me backstage. "You ready?" I laughed. "As ready as I'll ever be." When I walked onto the stage, the room erupted into applause. Hundreds of employees stood, clapping, smiling. Some of them had been with me since the warehouse days. Others had joined recently, but every single one of them had helped build something bigger than any one person. Near the front row, I spotted Mom, Dad, and Mason, not sitting separately, together, like a family. For the first time in a very long time, I stepped up to the microphone. The room slowly became quiet. I smiled, then said, "When people see this company, they usually ask me the same question. What's the secret to success?" I paused. The truth is, success isn't built by never failing. It's built by refusing to let failure decide who you become. I wasn't the favorite child. I wasn't the most popular. I wasn't the one everyone believed in. But someone else's opinion never gets to decide your future. The audience applauded. I looked toward my family. Mom was crying. Dad smiled proudly. Mason nodded, not because the past had disappeared, but because we'd finally stopped pretending it never happened. Sometimes, you don't get the childhood you deserved. Sometimes, the people who should have believed in you don't. But that doesn't mean your story ends there. Sometimes, the greatest thing you can build isn't a company. It's a life that proves you never needed permission to dream.